I'm really excited tonight to have Tim Wood with us. He was born in San Francisco to parents with deep Marin roots. His father was a third-generation son of San Rafael, and his mother was fourth-generation daughter of Mill Valley. Tonight's presentation is titled Blithedale, the Cushings Place in Marin. And this presentation will last just about an hour. And after that, we'll have 15 minutes or so for Q&As. So if you have any questions, we'd really appreciate you holding your questions for the Q&A. As background for tonight's talk, Tim's ancestors include John Oscar Eldridge, the promoter behind the Eldridge Grade and quite a colorful character, Sidney Barlow Cushing, the founding president of the Mountain Railroad, and John Cushing, the founder of the Blithedale Hotel. But now I'm going to go off script here for a second, because both Tim and I wanted to bring to your attention the recent passing of our dear friend, Mr. William Mason, who at 98 years old resided at the One Cottage Avenue on West Blithedale in the house built by Sidney Cushing. And I interviewed Mr. Mason in 2015. Could there be a more elegant or interesting man? No. He was just wonderful, and he became a friend to me and to Tim as he carefully guarded the history of the Cushing home and kept the house largely intact. And we are very sorry to see him go. And if you're at all interested to hear his fantastic life, you can listen to his oral history. Just go to the Mill Valley Public Library Oral History Collections, William Mason, and you'll hear a story that will blow you away. I think of Tim and his mother, Ellie Wood, a lot. I mean, Tim's a really nice guy, and we're friends. We've had adventures looking for historical things around the West Blithedale, but probably more so because I live on Cushing and Eldridge. So every time I get in my car or walk and drive, I'm reminded of this family. In the process of interviewing Tim and his mom, I learned that the Cushings and the Eldridges were of Puritan stock. They all came to America from England during the 1630s and settled in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. The Cushings eventually in Rhode Island, Providence, and the Eldridges were in Massachusetts. I asked Tim what brought the families west, and of course he responded with a chuckle, the gold rush. I asked Tim how the Blithedale Hotel got its name. It's common knowledge that the Blithedale Hotel was named after a book written in the mid-1800s by Nathaniel Hawthorne called The Blithedale Romance. Who's read that book here? You read it since the interview. Yeah, I asked him in the interview, did you read the book? And he said, no, it's on my list. Well, you got it. You know, it's a great book. But when in response to how the hotel, did John Cushing know Nathaniel Hawthorne? And this is Tim's response. Some people speculated that he, John Cushing, might have been a classmate of Nathaniel Hawthorne's because Hawthorne, who wrote the book, Blithedale Romance, went to Bowdoin, where John went, but that's not the case. They were 20 years apart in age, and so Hawthorne was long gone from the school by the time John Cushing came along. And I of course, had to read the romance, which is about a sort of utopian farm, life on a utopian farm. It's a lively and beautifully written book about a group of friends who engage in bohemian thought and communal life, but at the same time bring with them their very ingrained sense of entitlement. Sound familiar? Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Tim Wood.
The mic on? People can hear all right? Good. Good. Well, thank you for that nice introduction. And, geez, she gave most of the talk. Are there any questions? Or we can all go home. As background to tonight's presentation, I'll tell you that the seeds for this talk were sown about 60 years ago in a 1958 Ford Fairlane sedan southbound on 101. I was about 10 years old at the time and was in the back seat with a brother and maybe a couple of cousins, and my grandmother, Dolly Jenckes, who you see here, was behind the wheel. And as she did every time we got to this intersection, she'd launch into a family history lecture that went like this. Do you see that sign for the Blithedale exit? That sign wouldn't be here today if my grandfather, your great-great-grandfather, hadn't read the Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne in the 1860s or the 1870s, I'm not sure just when, and named his hotel after that book. That's where the name came from. And then all those kids in the back seat would elbow one another and roll our eyes because we'd heard the lecture a dozen times before, and we were all too young and clueless to really appreciate what she was talking about. So it took me about 50 years to get it, and then I wanted to know more. So the hotel that Dolly was talking about was the Blithedale Hotel. It sat at the base of Mount Tamalpais in what is today Mill Valley. It was one of the most fashionable summer resorts in Northern California during its heyday. Blithedale's founder, Dolly's grandfather, was Dr. John Cushing. So tonight I want to tell you the story of the Blithedale Hotel, and with it the story of the Cushing family that owned and operated the resort from its founding in 1873 till its close in 1910. This is a cast of characters in tonight's talk. Upper left, John Cushing, Blithedale's founder. To his right is his wife, Harriet. They married in 1856, had two children, Sidney Barlow Cushing and Marian Cushing. In 1886, Sidney married Grace Eldridge, the daughter of John Oscar Eldridge, and they had two children, John Eldridge Cushing and Eleanor Dolly Cushing, my grandmother. So over its nearly 40 years of history, Blithedale had four owners, John, Harriet, Sidney, and Grace. So they'll all play starring roles in tonight's story. We'll start with John. John Cushing was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1822. He was the eighth of 10 children. I don't know an awful lot about his early life, but I do know that in the 1840s he trained as a homeopath in the East. It was a profession he'd follow for the rest of his life, but not in the East. In 1852, he got caught up in the rush to California. He sailed to San Francisco via Panama, arriving in December of that year, and he right away set up shop as a homeopath. He was one of the first homeopathic doctors in the American West. His first office was on Portsmouth Square, right in the heart of the city, and you couldn't have had a better location, but it didn't do him much good at the time. San Francisco was a pretty rough and tumble American outpost in those days. The economy was chaotic, money was scarce, and while he had lots of patients, he had very few that could actually pay him for his services. And on top of that, homeopaths were considered quacks by the local medical establishment, and so he had a credibility issue on his hands. But the man persisted and eventually developed a stable business and gained renown in the Bay Area as a physician. In 1856, John married Harriet Reed Barlow. She was a native of Vermont, born in 1833. As a young woman, she became a teacher. She traveled west, answering the call for teachers in California. She taught first in San Jose and later in San Francisco, where she met and married John, again in 1856. And again, they had two children, Sidney Barlow Cushing, born in 1857, and Marian Cushing, born 4 years later. Here are pictures of Sidney and Marian as kids. By the early 1870s, John's health was failing. He was suffering from heart disease. And in his own words, he just became done to death with his hectic medical practice in San Francisco. So he started looking around for a healthier location away from San Francisco's cold and fog, a place where he and his patients could convalesce and he could look after his patients at a more relaxed pace. Southern Marin provided an ideal location. It had a Mediterranean climate with warm, sunny summers. Mount Tam provided an elegant backdrop. The area at that time was overwhelmingly rural, so all the peace and quiet a body could want. And on top of all that, in 1868, regular ferry service had initiated between San Francisco and Sausalito, so there was good access to the city for his customers. So we don't know how, but sometime in 1872 or 1873, John found the spot he was looking for. There was a wedge of public land, about 800 acres in all, on the southeastern flank of Mount Tam. You can see the peaks of Mount Tamalpais there in the upper left. And this wedge of public land existed at the intersection of three Mexican ranchos: Rancho Sausalito to the west, Rancho Corte Madera del Presidio to the east, and Rancho San Quintin to the north. So in 1873, John filed homestead petitions on two parcels of land within this tract. You can see them outlined here in red and screened in white, each about 160 acres in size. He paid a $10 filing fee on each of those parcels, and with that got provisional title to the land. And then things got complicated. There were two strings attached with this property. The first string involved the King family, which had been operating a dairy farm on the southern parcel for since the 1850s. Mr. King apparently died early on, but Mary King and her two sons continued the dairy operation, but they made a mistake. Nobody in the family filed for title to the land. And so they were essentially squatters. And when the Cushings filed their homestead petitions, the Kings had to go. But they didn't go empty-handed. John signed a promissory note to Mary King for $2,100, about $50,000 in today's valuation, and with a further promise to pay 1% interest on the unpaid balance per month. With that, the Kings left and moved to Tamalpais Valley, and the Cushings were free to move on to the land. The second string involved Samuel Throckmorton, and it was much more contentious. In the early 1870s, now Throckmorton was the guy who had acquired Rancho Sausalito from William Richardson. In the early 1870s, he was expanding his holdings to the east of Corte Madera Creek, and he had his eye on the southern tip of this wedge of public land. And when the Cushings filed their homestead petitions, it was discovered that the two parcels overlapped by about 20 to 30 acres, and Throckmorton was unhappy. And if family lore is correct, he used his influence in Washington to block the issuance of the Cushings homestead patents on that southern parcel. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I do know that in 1883, a year before the patent on the southern parcel issued, Harriet Cushing sold that disputed acreage to the Throckmortons. So you can make of that what you will. So these are the boundaries of those homestead parcels now outlined on top of a Google satellite view of the Mill Valley area. Downtown Mill Valley here, we're right here at the public library, Corte Madera up there in the upper right. Anyway, the western boundary of the parcels formed by Corte Madera Creek. The southern boundary coincides with today's Oakdale Avenue. The eastern boundary climbed Blithedale Ridge and then zigzagged back and forth across the top of that ridge several times before finally descending just south of the H-Line Fire Road. So that's the lay of the land. Again, each of those parcels is about 160 acres. So anyway, back to 1873, 1874. With provisional title to the land now, the Cushings were free to move on to onto their property. They sold their home in San Francisco and literally moved, lock, stock, and barrel, to Marin. And two maps tell us something about what they encountered when they arrived and what they accomplished during their first year. The first map is this 1873 U.S. Coast Survey, which is kind of a remarkable topographic map for its day. You can see the various Blithedale Ridge and Middle Ridge here. I've outlined the homestead parcels in red, but what I want to bring attention to is this inset here that shows, again, in 1873, this is the year the Cushings moved to Marin, the King Farm, right here. And it's a pretty spare operation, just two buildings. There was a dwelling and a stable or a shed just south of that dwelling. The dwelling is undoubtedly the King farmhouse, and most believe that the Cushings made it their residence when they first moved onto the property. The nature of the second building is uncertain. There was an old adobe shed on the property that had probably been built in the 1830s. But the adobe shed was to the north of the farmhouse and not to the south. So I don't really know whether that icon represents the adobe shed put in the wrong place or whether there was a third building on the property, a stable or a farm shed. Okay, but again, a very spare operation, not much there when they arrived. The second map of interest is that 1874 Government Land Office survey that I showed you earlier that showed the wedge of public land. And I've shown a blow up here, the outline of the southern homestead parcel there in red. I'm going to make that disappear. So this is now 1 year after the Cushings have been on the property, and there are now 6 buildings in that corner of the southern parcel. And they're labeled Cushing's Stable, Cushing's Eating House, Cushing's Dwelling, Cushing's House, New House, and Carpenter's House. The eating house is probably the old farmhouse that by this time has been converted into an inn with guest rooms upstairs and a kitchen and dining room downstairs. Cushing's Stable may be that second shed that was on the previous map, or maybe it was built by the Cushings. We really don't know. Cushing's Dwelling is their residence. They built a home early on for themselves. And the other 3 buildings are likely guest cottages for the new resort. So I've never seen a photograph of the King Farm, and I've never seen a photograph of Blithedale during its first year or two. The earliest image of the campus that I've seen is this oil painting dated 1878. And it shows the inn and the stable over here on the left-hand side. This is the Cushing's Dwelling here in the middle. That was their residence. The 3 buildings on the hillside are guest cottages. This building later on in the resort's history would become known as the Moore Cottage, and this one the Monteagle Cottage, named after 2 families that summered every year at Blithedale and occupied those cottages. This prominent building in the foreground is the Parlor Cottage. It housed the resort's main parlor and with guest rooms upstairs. And it was probably built sometime after that first wave of construction, probably between 1875 and 1877. Now, the painting shows another couple of interesting features of the campus. Number one, the disparate design of the buildings. No 2 buildings sort of follow the same architecture, right? And number 2, they're sort of scattered haphazardly on that hillside. And that was unusual for the day. Most other resorts that had a central hotel and satellite cottages, the buildings had kind of a uniform architecture, and they were often arranged in some regular pattern on the campus, either around a central garden or along a central drive. That was the case too at Calistoga Hot Springs Resort in the northern Napa Valley. Again, uniform architecture and sort of a regular placement of buildings. Not so at Blithedale. Again, as shown in this photograph, now probably taken about the same time that painting was made. Again, the inn and the stable, the Cushing's residence, 2 of the guest cottages on the hillside, the other buildings obscured by trees. But again, disparate architecture, no 2 buildings kind of look alike, and again, haphazardly placed on the grounds. We don't know why this is, but Dolly Jenkins, my grandmother, thought that most of the early cottages were built not by the Cushings per se, but by their early guests. as personal guest cottages that they would occupy summer after summer after summer, in some sort of arrangement with the Cushings. As Deborah pointed out, the resort was called Blithedale from the beginning, almost certainly named after Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, The Blithedale Romance. Some have said maybe there was a connection between John and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Maybe there was a family connection between the Cushings and the Hawthornes, but not so. I doubt it. I think it's more likely that John or maybe Harriet read the Blithedale Romance, loved the book, saw some similarities between their venture in Marin and Hawthorne's description of communal life on Blithedale Farm, and that was good enough for them. That's what they were going to call their resort. That said, it took some time for that name to catch on. And in early newspaper articles published during the 1870s, Blithedale was just as often referred to as Dr. Cushing's Place, or Dr. Cushing's Settlement, or Dr. Cushing's Infirmary or Health Institute as well. And throughout the resort's history, the name was just as likely to be spelled in the press with a Y, Blythedale, as it was to be spelled with an I, which always made Google searches impossible. Those same early newspaper articles also referred to Blithedale as a resort, a place for relaxation and recreation. And so from the get-go, Blithedale was an interesting combination of health retreat and recreational resort. And that was clear in an ad that John ran early on for the resort, where he called Blithedale the best place for recreation, for convalescence, for ladies and children in the state. So clearly early on, he was thinking both recreation and health. And this was not a novel idea. Most resorts of the day followed this pattern. The early American resorts established during the colonial period, between the colonial period and the Civil War, were typically established around hot springs and mineral springs, and they were all about health, promising water cures for all sorts of ailments, and people went to them for that. Then following the Civil War, as the nation industrialized and the pace of life quickened, resorts took on the added benefit of providing relaxation and leisure and recreation, kind of an escape from the harried pace of city life. So that was certainly the case at Blithedale, and again, very typical for the day. Business appeared to have been pretty good early on. This article published in the Marin Journal in January of 1876 said the retreat has now been established 2 years. There are 30 sleeping rooms, and last season there were at one time 80 people there. We have no doubt that double the present accommodations will be required next summer. So business seems to have been good early on. Perhaps too good for John, because he, as a matter of fact, became done to death with his resort business as well. In the spring of 1879, he fell seriously ill with heart disease, and over the summer, his condition worsened, and he died at Blithedale on September 1st of 1879. He was just 57 years old. And he died without a will, which meant that when the estate was settled, it was divided between his wife and his children. So Harriet inherited a 50% share of Blithedale, and Sidney and Marian each got 50%. But for all intents and purposes, Harriet, who is now a widow in her late 40s, took charge. Harriet was a sturdy and capable woman. She played I'm guessing she played a really strong role in managing Blithedale from the get-go, particularly given John's poor health. And she certainly took the lead in running the resort after John's death, with Marian and Sidney's help, of course. She reopened the resort in the summer of 1880 under a new name, the Blithedale Hotel. But again, in the press, it was just as often known as Mrs. Cushing's Place. Without John, Blithedale lost its focus on health and convalescence and became a recreational resort, pure and simple. And it also became a summer-only operation, opening its doors at the beginning of May and closing about the end of September, with the Cushings moving to San Rafael or San Francisco for the winter. A couple of turning points for the resort. In 1882, the patent on the northern homestead parcel issued. So they now own that piece of property free and clear. And then 2 years later, the patent on the southern homestead issued, that one in Harriet's name. So the family now owned about 300 acres in Blithedale Canyon, free and clear, including the land under the hotel. So that must have been a relief for them. So with business good and all those land ownership issues settled, the Cushings started making some improvements to the place. In the early 1880s, they gave the old inn a facelift. They wrapped it in shingles and added a wraparound front porch. They converted the stable into a guest cottage. They built a tennis court out in front of the inn. They put a dam on Corte Madera Creek and built a swimming hole, and life was good. And then in 1884, Harriet installed a telephone at the resort. It was one of the first telephones in Marin, and it definitely improved her access to customers and suppliers in San Francisco. Prior to that time, Sidney would have been a convenient messenger for her. He had taken a job in San Francisco in the late 1870s and was commuting back and forth. But in 1883, he went to work for Albert Kent and moved to Chicago to manage Albert Kent's affairs at the Chicago Board of Trade. That position lasted 4 years, and during that time, Sidney would return to Marin from time to visit family and help manage the resort, and to visit this young lady, Grace Eldridge. They met at Blithedale in 1881, and over the course of the next 4 or 5 years fell in love, and in 1886 they were married. They spent their first year together in Chicago while Sidney completed his assignment with Albert Kent. But in 1887, they moved back to San Rafael and moved into Grace's house on 4th Street. There they raised 2 children, again, John Eldridge Cushing, who was born in 1887, and my grandmother, who was born in 1889. Once back in Marin, Sidney wasted no time in integrating himself into the local business community. He became a director of San Rafael Gas and Electric Company. He partnered with Ernest Ransom in a concrete contracting business in San Francisco. He continued to work for Albert Kent, managing his West Coast interests now. And he partnered with his mother in expanding business at the Blithedale Hotel. Their first big project, completed in 1888, was to add this great big addition, 3-story addition, to the front of the hotel. You can see it here during its first year of operation. You can just make out the roof line of the old inn behind the hotel, and there are a couple of platform tents out on the lawn in front. They also expanded kitchen facilities and dining facilities and so forth to the rear of the hotel. In all, they expanded the footprint of the hotel complex about 3-fold, and they increased the guest capacity at the resort to about 125 to 150. The expansion turned out to be pretty timely. It coincided with the time when society columns were coming into vogue in Bay Area newspapers, and in rapid fashion, both Blithedale and its guests became regular fare in those society columns. This article from the San Francisco Chronicle, 1886, the 4th at Blithedale, says, among those who contributed to the celebration of the 4th at Blithedale were the following at Mrs. Dr. Cushing's: Colonel and Mrs. Smedberg, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, Major and Mrs. McClung, and so forth. Or this article from the Daily Alta California in 1888, Colonel and Mrs. H.R. Willier are located at Blithedale for the summer. And this, Mr. and Mrs. Timothy Page have gone to Blithedale for the summer months. So the list goes on and on. There are literally hundreds of mentions like these in the papers. And if it hadn't been before, Blithedale now took on the dimensions of a social resort, a place where fashionable families from around the Bay Area went to spend their summers to both play and to relax, as well as to socialize with one another and to be seen in one another's company by those who followed society events. And when I say gathered for the summer, I mean it. I mean, many of these families would move to Blithedale in the middle of June and stay there through August. So for them, Blithedale was sort of a summer colony, a refuge, if you will, from San Francisco's cold and fog for the entire summer. A few of the fashionable guests, Colonel William Smedberg and his wife Fanny, Major Joseph McClung, both were Civil War veterans, officers in the Civil War who, after the war, moved to San Francisco and established successful businesses. McClung made headline news in 1903 when he was shot and killed in Lillian Coit's apartment at the Palace Hotel. Details at 11. We'll go into detail. Adolph Sutro is an occasional visitor at Blithedale. He made a fortune in the Comstock Lode and in San Francisco real estate. He was also San Francisco's 24th mayor. And William Thomas, another successful San Francisco lawyer who counted among his clients William Kent, Sidney Cushing, and the Mountain Railroad. Other notable families from San Francisco: Timothy and Mary Page, George and Catherine Moore, Louis and Lydia Monteagle, George and Charlotte Sanderson, and from Oakland, Charles and Etta Allen. That's Charles at the top, mugging for the camera. His wife Etta there. The Knights, the Hinckleys, the Costigans. I'm bringing these names up. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself there. Let me just say that the gentlemen, for the most part, were successful businessmen from San Francisco. Many were members of the Bohemian Club or the Pacific Union Club. The ladies were associated with high-profile charities. Most of the families were mentioned in the San Francisco Blue Book of social elites. They were a notable bunch, and they contributed significantly to Blithedale's renown. Now, I'm mentioning all these names because, for selfish reasons, I'm still in search of Blithedale photographs and memorabilia. And I'm hoping that some of you might know some descendants of one or more of these people. You might know an Allen or a Bafus or a Costigan or a Page or a McClung who might have photo albums or scrapbooks or bundles of letters in their attics. If you do, let them know I'm looking, or let me know and I'll contact them. I'm sure there are many, many more photos out there. So what was life like at the Blithedale Hotel? This wonderful panoramic photo taken from up on Middle Ridge shows a bird's eye view of the resort and shows its layout really nicely. The hotel complex is here in the trees at right. You can see smoke coming out of the kitchen chimney. There was a large kitchen garden behind the hotel. This is the old adobe. This is a guest cottage. That was the Cushing residence, by this time turned into guest accommodations, and a platform tent right there. Anyway, the resort was secluded still in these days. It literally sat alone in Blithedale Canyon, surrounded by nature, lots of peace and quiet, lots of opportunities for recreation. It was relatively rustic, no electricity until 1895, no running hot water until late in the game. Accommodations included hotel rooms and suites, guest cottages, and platform tents. Here are Fred and Clara Knight, glamping at Blithedale in 1888. I think if I were Fred, I'd put that newspaper down and pay some attention to my wife. She's looking pretty bored. Meals were served in communal dining rooms. I don't know that this is a Blithedale dining room. This photo was taken in about 1890 at a Mill Valley Old Timers luncheon, but I do know that that's Sidney Cushing sitting at the end of the table. Meals were hearty. Staples like flour and sugar and coffee and tea and hams and pickles were provided from wholesalers in San Francisco. Fresh fruits and vegetables and fresh eggs and fresh milk were provided on site by Blithedale's kitchen garden, its herd of cows, flock of chickens, and orchards. Room and board, booze at Blithedale, likely kept under wraps early on. And I get that from a note in Sausalito News from 1889. It spoke of a conversation between two men on the Sausalito ferry, and one proclaimed that Blithedale was a total abstinence resort, at which boarders are not allowed to keep a private bottle of spirits in their rooms. Yes, replied the other, they do better than that. They keep it by the demijohn, a bottle not holding enough for them. So you can make of that what you will. Porches were important places for socializing at Blithedale. Here's a group assembled on the porch of the old inn in the early 1880s. Looks like it was a pet-friendly resort. There's a dog there. And another group assembled on the veranda of one of the platform tents. Al Knight, who you'll hear a little bit about in a minute, sitting at center, and Louis Monteagle at the right with a tennis racket, which brings us to two favorite sports at Blithedale, croquet and tennis. Again, the old tennis court sat out in front of the inn. There was hiking on the mountain with hikes to the old mill, to the falls on Cascade Creek. People went up the top of East Peak. Swimming in the pond behind the dam on Cortobadera Creek. Evenings were dominated by parlor life. No big screen TV, no Xbox, no stereo. Instead, conversation, reading, board games, needlework, and lots of homegrown entertainment, plays and pantomimes. Here a group seems to be bidding a teary adieu to somebody who's sailing off across the ocean. You can see the Chinese cook getting into the act here, waving goodbye as well. And there were costumes galore. They had this amazing wardrobe of costumes that people seem to be wearing all the time. Here some children are involved in some sort of international pageant, as closely as I can tell. The 4th of July was famously celebrated with gusto at Blithedale. This is the parade group from the 1888 celebration, complete with a marching band and, again, costumes. We've got Uncle Sam and Lady Liberty, a college professor, and more. Blithedale was also a destination for several Bay Area sporting events. The Bay City Wheelmen was a San Francisco bicycling club that made an annual ride to Blithedale every year during the 1890s. Here they are arriving at the resort, coming up the main lane, and here they are gathered out in front of the hotel on the lawn. And on July 7th, 1901, the greatest baseball contest ever brought off in Marin County was played at Blithedale on a diamond of limited size and perpendicular slope. It featured the Blithedale Poison Oaks against the Belvedere Little Neck Clams, the Oaks beating the Clams 18-8 in 5 innings. It was a tongue-in-cheek society affair. Whoops. Getting to Blithedale could be an adventure in itself, particularly in the early days. The trip always started with a ferry ride across San Francisco Bay to Sausalito. There, passengers met the North Pacific Coast Railroad and were carried a few miles north to either Summit Station or the Blithedale Alto Station, depending on the time frame. There they were met by the Blithedale stage, a big 4-in-hand carriage, and where they're transported across miles of dusty farm track, the old dairy farms, to the mouth of Blithedale Canyon and then onto the resort. That journey was streamlined significantly in 1890 when this spur was built by the North Pacific Coast Railroad. It ran from Almonte Junction to a terminus about a half a mile from the Blithedale Hotel. And this development foreshadowed big changes to come for the resort. Big changes in the form of a brand new town called Mill Valley. Mill Valley's founding represented a true turning point for the Blithedale Hotel. In a nutshell, during the summer of 1889, the resort largely stood alone in its little corner of the world, and its guests could count on all the peace and quiet they can want. By 1890, that peace and quiet was shattered. The previous winter and fall, Tamalpais Land and Water literally etched this new town into the landscape to the west of Corte Madera Creek and the Blithedale Hotel, whose location I've indicated here. Hundreds of lots were surveyed and staked. Roads were graded, sewer lines and water lines were laid. And in May of 1890, Tamalpais Land and Water started selling lots. Some 200 lots sold at that first auction in May. Construction of summer camps and cottages began immediately, and the town grew from there at a lightning fast pace. By 1892, there were 150 summer camps in Mill Valley, 700 summer residents. There were almost 100 year-round homes. Businesses were opening downtown, including new hotels and boarding houses and entertainment halls. There were, and on top of that, hundreds of visitors and day hikers descending on the town during the weekends. Despite the commotion across Corte Madera Creek, life seemed to continue pretty much as normal during the early 1890s. The fashionable families continued to summer at the resort. Harriet and Sidney continued to be involved, although by this point they were bringing in professional managers to run the day-to-day operations. This ad for the hotel, run in 1892, noted Blithedale, Mill Valley, the prettiest place in California. Climate is almost perfect. The walks and drives are unsurpassed. A lovely pond among the redwoods near the house furnishes ample facilities for swimming and bathing. A living spring gives drinking water of sparkling cleanliness or clearness. The sewage system is perfect. The cows pastured on the hills of the place give milk and cream in abundance and of absolute purity, and so forth and so on. So at least for promotional purposes, life seemed good. But not necessarily for the residents of Blithedale. It seems that early on, with this sudden influx of crowds on the other side of Corte Madera Creek, the Blithedale set developed a little angst and resentment. And a couple of articles published in the Sausalito News characterized them as a bunch of blue-blooded snobs who were turning their noses up at their new Mill Valley neighbors. And I've got a quick quote here from one of those articles. It says, "A friendly rivalry seems to have sprung up between our neighbors at the old summer resort of Dr. Cushing of Blithedale and the elite of Mill Valley. We are in a position to assert that for the first time in the history of Blithedale's summer resort, its 150 feel the necessity of asserting their hitherto undisputed claim to be considered the creme de la creme of society in these parts. Al Knight, who you remember from the group gathered on the front porch of the tent, Al Knight, the leader of the Blithedale Society, is in turn depressed and excited over the matter. As he wandered a few evenings since by the banks of Corte Madera Creek, he was heard to exclaim in frenzied tones, 'Give me blood, blood, azure blood.'" And the article goes on, but they're really ribbing the Blithedale crowd for kind of being snobs and not mingling with their new Mill Valley neighbors. And that's really just half the story, in that the Cushings themselves seemed to be a little standoffish. They declined an offer from Tamalpais Land and Water to cooperate in building a new road up the lower stretches of Blithedale Canyon. And then a second incident actually came to blows one Sunday morning when one of the new Mill Valley residents wandered onto the Blithedale property, helped himself to a drink of water out of a tap. Sidney Cushing confronted him, and the article said that words were exchanged, resulting in blows when the intruder hit Cushing a square fist in the face, knocking him on his back. So more unfriendliness. It turns out the problems were fairly short-lived. Within a year or two, the Cushings were cooperating eagerly with Tamalpais Land and Water and helping to build new roads and lay sewer lines and water lines in the area. I suspect that Sidney Cushing saw some writing on the wall on the one hand, and also looked at Mill Valley's meteoric rise and said to himself, boy, this land we've got might be valuable real estate, and maybe the future lays in Subdivision. Because in 1894, Sidney and Harriet undertook a subdivision of their own. They divided about 8 acres of land at the base of their holdings, creating 37 lots, which they began to sell over the next few years. There were more Cushing subdivisions to come, but in 1895, another opportunity caught Sidney's imagination. Scenic railroad to the top of Mount Tamalpais. I'm not going to say much about the railroad tonight. It's a story unto itself, but I'll make a few comments about how the railroad impacted Blithedale's business. First of all, the railroad attracted national acclaim, and so it really raised the profile of Mill Valley as a tourist destination. And that was a good thing for the Cushing's resort business. More tourists meant more demand for hotel rooms, right? On the other hand, the railroad passed within just 100 feet of the hotel. And so you can easily imagine the resort's peace and quiet being eroded just that much further, with steam locomotives thundering by 3 or 4 times a day. And on top of that, Sidney Cushing was named founding president of the railroad. So he became a very busy man at a time when the Blithedale Hotel needed his attention more than ever. By 1895, Marian Cushing had basically dropped out of the picture. She had married and had moved to Santa Venetia to raise her family. Then in 1897, Harriet Cushing fell ill and passed away. And at that point, ownership of the Blithedale Hotel passed to Sidney, who again was a pretty busy guy. Not only was he president of the Scenic Railway, but he was also still managing Albert Kent's West Coast interests. He was still president of San Rafael Gas and Electric. He still had his concrete contracting business in San Francisco, and now he was owner of the Blithedale Hotel. How did he handle all these responsibilities? Delegating and getting rid of some of the businesses. He leased and eventually sold San Rafael Gas and Electric to the concern that would eventually become PG&E. He sold his interest in the, no booing now. He sold his interest in the contracting business, and he began leasing Blithedale to professional managers that would run the resort for their own gain. From 1899 to 1906, Mrs. Robinson leased the resort and ran it, and apparently did a good job of it. She converted the old adobe into a bar and billiards room. Several new cottages were built on the grounds. This photo taken in 1907 shows the resort from the south, and you can see several of the new cottages here in the foreground. The Parlor cottage there, and the old the hotel in the background. The resort remained popular during the early years of the 1900s, but change was in the air. By 1905, few of the old guard continued to summer at the resort. They've sort of gone their own way. And as the decade progressed, Blithedale became more known for its Saturday evening dances, which were held on an almost weekly basis, and its Sunday dinners. Known more for those dances and dinners than it was as a fashionable retreat for San Francisco's elite. So it's sort of moving away from being a summer colony for those fashionable families and more as sort of a weekend resort for short-term vacationers and weekend visitors. And Sidney Cushing probably drove much of that change himself. As I said, there were more Cushing subdivisions to come. And in 1903 and 1905, Marian and Sidney established 3 more subdivisions, such that by 1905, the Blithedale Hotel, its grounds right here, were completely surrounded by residential lots. Mill Valley to the west and Cushing subdivisions to the south, the east, and the north. About 50 acres of land subdivided here, 170 new lots put in. It was a far cry from the landscape that John Cushing had found in 1873. In addition, Sidney teamed up with William Kent on a number of land development and land conservation projects in Marin in the early 1900s. The two were friends and close business associates. They had a lot in common. Both had moved to Marin as boys. They both grew up with Mount Tam in their backyards, hunting and hiking and camping on the mountain. They loved southern Marin, knew it well. And as I say, during the early years of the new century, they cooperated in a number of land development and conservation projects. Early on, they worked to develop the Stinson Sand Spit into a seaside resort. And the Dipsea Inn and the road from West Point down to the coast were part of that effort. In 1901, they spearheaded a proposal to have Mount Tam recognized as a national park. Never gained much traction. And then in 1906 and 1907, they worked together to open Redwood Canyon as a tourist destination. Kent bought the land there to preserve the redwoods. Cushing built a spur of the railroad down into the site, and the railroad further built an inn and hiking trails and some carriage roads down there to improve tourist access. Thanks to the generous gift of the Kents, this area would come to become Muir Woods National Monument. William Kent continued to practice his brand of progressive conservation for years to come, but for Sidney Cushing, the opening of Redwood Canyon was kind of a last accomplishment. Sidney suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, and by 1906, his health was failing. In 1907 and 1908, he took several leaves of absence to attend to his health. But in 1909, in May of 1909, he suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed on his right side and sent him into a deep depression. He was eventually able to walk again with the aid of a cane, but he never regained his spirit. And in September of that year, he took his own life along a wooded path at Blithedale. He was just 52. Sidney's wife, Grace, was his sole heir, so ownership of Blithedale at this point passed to her. She leased the resort for the 1910 season, and it opened as usual on May 1st. The resort got some society press that year, but again, as in previous years, it seemed to be more known for its Saturday night dances and its Sunday dinners. The last Saturday night dance of the season was held on September the 17th, and then a few days later, Blithedale closed for the year, and as it turns out, closed for good. This photo shows the Parlor cottage and a neighboring guest cottage during that winter, I think, of 1910, 1911. First year it was closed. Grace filed her final papers in probate court on September 10th, 1910. And on that very same day, published this ad in the San Francisco Chronicle, offering Blithedale, the hotel grounds, and all the buildings as a package deal for sale, it says, at a bargain price. Apparently, there were no takers. So Grace went to Plan B. And the following year, she raised the hotel. She knocked down most of the old cottages and subdivided the hotel grounds, 15 acres, creating 72 building lots, which went on sale the next year with this sales brochure promising beautifully wooded lots, freedom from fog and wind, superb views of Mount Tam, so forth and so on. Very easy terms. This is a photo of the foundations of the old hotel after it had been knocked down. You can see the old adobe shed under the oak tree here. And a view of a newly graded West Blithedale Avenue as it runs through the old hotel grounds. The foundations of the inn up on the rise there. I don't know why Grace decided to close Blithedale, but my best guess is that times had changed and the resort had run its course. Buildings were aging; they were neither fancy nor elegant anymore. The signature guests had moved on, and the resort had lost its seclusion. It was now surrounded by residential development. On top of that, its reputation and appeal had become eclipsed, I think, by the hundreds of summer resorts that had sprung up around California, many more elegant and fancy than the Blithedale Hotel. Resorts like the Hotel Del Monte in Monterey, the Tahoe Tavern at Lake Tahoe, the Hotel Potter at Santa Barbara, all within easy reach of San Franciscans, thanks to the Southern Pacific Railroad. In 1915, Grace moved out of her house in San Rafael and into the Cushing cottage at today's #1 Cottage Avenue. And for the next 27 years from that vantage point, she kept watch over her neighborhood. She continued to sell lots in the various Cushing subdivisions, as well as blocks of land to other developers. She traveled, she loved to travel. She dabbled in genealogy. She maintained an active social life and remained busy in civic affairs. And then in 1942, she set a longevity record for the Cushings when she died at the age of 80 on November the 4th of that year. The Blithedale grounds look a little bit different today than they did back in the heyday of the resort. Here is West Blithedale Avenue running through what was then the hotel grounds. The neighborhood is filled in, the trees have grown, and the houses have grown. But if you know where to look, you can still find vestiges of the old resort. Several of the old cottages still remain at 172 and 188 West Blithedale and at 40 Portola Lane, all remodeled now into year-round houses. The old adobe still exists, attached to a home at 205 West Blithedale, and the Cushing Cottage at #1 Cottage Avenue, still there and largely unchanged. For those who are interested, I put together this map overlay that shows the locations of the various Blithedale buildings and resort features superimposed over a Google map of today's neighborhood. So you can see the lanes running through the resort, the hotel complex here, the Parlor Cottage was there, the Green Roof Cottage and so forth, the dams on Corte Madera Creek and the railroad grade running through. It makes a nice guide for a walking tour of that neighborhood. And beyond that, the Blithedale name lives on today on street signs and trail signs, and on area maps as Blithedale Summit Preserve and Blithedale Avenue and Blithedale Ridge and so forth. And that's the story of the Blithedale Hotel. Before I sit, I've got a lot of people to thank, and I'm just going to run through the list very quickly here, because lots and lots of people contributed to this effort. Kate Mayfield and the staff at the Lucretia Little History Room here in this building helped out in innumerable ways. Lori Thompson and Carol Aquaviva at the Kent, California room. Local historians Phil Rhodes, Dewey Livingston, Joe Breeze, Fred Runner, Brad Rippey, Fran Capoletti, hi Fran, and Richard Torney and Phil back here. All contributed photographs and advice and other angles on Marin history that I wasn't aware of. And of course, many people have written about Blithedale before me: Barry Spitz, Claudine Chalmers, Helen Van Cleve Park, Henry Busey, and Jack Mason all provided sort of a foundation for my efforts. And you've already talked about Bill Mason, so I won't go any further with that. But I've got a picture of Bill here. I was going to say a few words about him. I met Bill in this room about 5 years ago when I gave a talk on the Cushing and Eldridge families. And after the talk, he was sitting in the second row, and this man just started peppering me with questions. And it finally came to learn that he lived in Grace Cushing's old house and had for like 50 years. And he invited my wife and I to visit him there, and it was just a thrill for me to see that house. My mother had told me about it. She'd played in the house when she was a little girl, and Bill was just a wonderful guy, and we're going to miss him.
Yes, I really, really advise that you listen to his oral history. And first of all, I want to say fantastic presentation.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm sure we have some questions. And repeat the question after you heard.
Yeah.
A couple of questions about the adobe hut that you mentioned. Was that the building that remains, I believe, is the oldest structure in Mill Valley. I've heard it's from the 1850s, but from your talk, was that originally part of the King Farm?
Some have speculated. I don't think they know with absolute certainty what the origin of it is. Some people think it might have been an old Mexican hunting lodge or something like that, built in the 1830s. But beyond that, I don't know. That an archaeologist did some work on it when the house was being remodeled, and he thought it was very old, and he thought he was finding evidence of fires having been burned in the ground. Beneath the hut. He said the structure of it was unique. So I don't know exactly when it was built, but they think it predated the King Farm. That's what I've heard. Yeah.
When they started to divide up the hotel property and sell those lots, what did they sell for?
You know, the answer is what did the lots on the old hotel grounds sell for? And I don't know the answer to that. I've looked at deeds, but the deeds always say sold for $1 in gold coin or something like that. They don't disclose the selling price in the deed, so I really don't know. Anybody else here might have any idea?
Yeah, my house was in 1905.
Pardon me?
Our property was sold in 1905. And it said $1 in gold.
Yeah, it's sort of this nominal thing they put in there to note that there was some exchange, but they don't disclose the sale price. So I just don't know the answer to that question.
If Cushing was part owner in the railroad, which was what was destroying their peace, wasn't he in conflict?
Oh, in those days, I don't think people worried about that. but in what way? The question is, since Sidney both owned a hotel and was part owner in the railroad, wasn't there a conflict of interest?
Yeah, because he was ruining the atmosphere of his hotel by putting the railroad through there.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know whether it was a surprise to him that people would have found it so noisy and maybe they didn't. I don't know. But I'm just guessing that if I'd been a longtime resident of the Blithedale Hotel and loved it for the peace and quiet, that train would have annoyed me after about day 3.
Okay, well, I think that, yeah.
Maybe.
One thing, you mentioned telephone or something in the 1880s?
1884.
So where did they have a line under the bay or?
You know, I don't know how it got across the bay to San Francisco. I'm guessing they ran it under the bay. Anybody know? Yeah.
I had a separate question.
Oh, okay. It was a question about the telephone line, and it ran from Sonoma, I think, down to San Francisco. The main line did, and I think Harriet just tapped into that line. I don't know where. Yeah, Google. Thank you.
Okay, you've got more questions.
Yeah, one back here.
Oh, I was just going to ask, do you know what, this is kind of an odd question, but do you know what year they piped water into the house?
Well, I think they piped water into the resort fairly early on. There was a spring above the resort on the hillside, and there was another spring up Corte Madera Creek. And they piped the water down to a large redwood tank that sat above the resort, and then from there it was piped into the hotel and to the other buildings.
Okay.
So no hot running water until late in the game, but I think they had cold running water fairly early on. And Dolly Cushing she remembered terrible screams as the gentlemen would take their showers in the morning because the water was ice cold coming out of that creek, and pretty unpleasant to shower with.
Right there.
Yeah.
You knock on the doors of the owner-occupiers of the current residents, and how receptive were they to you? How receptive might they be to us? What I look.
I never went into the yards, but you can see all those views from the street.
Right.
So I just walked up the street and took pictures.
You never talked to the.
Actually, we talked to one woman that owned one other cottage.
Well, that's true. We did run into people on the street, and we talked to them, and they were, all chatty about, their home being part of the Blithedale Hotel. And as I say, we became friends with Bill Mason, who owned the Cushing cottage, and he invited us in. But
And if we wanted to do a walking tour, could you put the slide up and maybe, with the overlay and maybe take a picture of it?
yeah, be happy to do that. And there's also a copy of, I've written all this up in hard copy form, and there's a copy of this in the library here. So if you wanted to copy the overlay, you can get it there as well.
Is it in the history room?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we hope to see you next month. We have award-winning writer Mark Arax talking about his latest book, The Dreamt Land, The Search for Dust and Water Across California. Okay. All right, thanks so much.